Drums are the foundation of popular music and have been since the modern drum kit was developed in the 1910s. Recording drums is challenging because they have a broad frequency range that can cover almost the entire audible spectrum. They have a wide dynamic range from the quiet tss of the hi-hat to the power of the kick, the snare, and the crash cymbal. And they have sharp, fast transients and low-frequency hits which cause issues with certain audio technology. The earliest forms of recording, wax cylinders and the like, just couldn't record them successfully, and even with the later introduction of the 78 lathe, drums were often left off a recording because the vibrations from the drum kit would bounce the cutting needle out of its track. When drums were included, they would be positioned well away from the microphone in the room, and the musicians arranged closer or further away from a single microphone to create balance within the recording. If the drums needed to be louder, the drummer was asked to play louder. If they needed to be quieter, they played quieter. By the 1940s, big band recording by producers and engineers such as Bill Putnam was done in studios which could mix up to 12 microphones into a mono or, in later years, stereo recording. Note that this isn't true multi-track recording because the recordings are only made to one track, not leaving any room for overdubs. Even with up to 12 microphones available in these recordings, the drums were never truly mic'd up. There's a 1989 interview where Putnam discussed using 4 microphones for the brass players, with the drums located behind them, allowing the bleed from the drums to be recorded on the brass players' mics. As an aside, this is probably a good time to point out that there is some considerable overlap between the recording techniques used by different producers, studios, and bands. Sometimes this is an aesthetic choice, but mostly it's working within the limitations of the technology afforded to the musicians in studios and the budget of their labels. We see a range of older sounds and techniques in today's recordings, and this pastiche, along with our historical closeness to today's subject matter, makes it harder to identify trends and the sound of our current decade until we've had a quarter century or so to look back at it. Single microphone recording techniques were still common until at least the end of the 1950s. Johnny Cash and his band cut their first record in 1955 with a single microphone. Only 3 years later, Buddy Holly released Peggy Sue, which used a Telefunken U47 overhead, an RCA ribbon on the kick, and an Electro Voice RE15 on the snare, plus a very interesting use of an echo chamber effect. Have a listen to it now if you like. A more common technique through the 50s and early 60s was to use a single overhead mic for drum recording, achieving a balance of the whole kit. This microphone was often heavily compressed, meaning that the dynamic range of the instrument was lessened and further consistency and balance could be achieved. The kick drum is often lost with this technique. For an example of this, listen to Jailhouse Rock by Elvis Presley. On the Motown records of the early 60s, drums were cut with a single overhead and fill mics on the kick and snare. Like previously, these were bussed to a single track on an 8-track recorder. In later years, the mics would have been Neumann KM86s, because in later years, Motown donated all of their mic stock and exclusively used KM86s for everything. I couldn't give you a history of drum recording without mentioning the Beatles. Their drum recording setup in this era was also quite basic. Typically, Norman Smith, their recording engineer, used a single overhead mic positioned low over the drum kit, about even with Ringo's eyes, along with a mic on the kick. And on the earliest records, these were both ribbon microphones, an ST4038 overhead, whilst the kick mic was an STC4033. As you know, ribbon microphones are fragile and their ribbons are easy to damage with the sorts of blasts of air that you get from a kick drum. So the 4033 was positioned well off-centre, about 1 o'clock on the kick drum, towards the edge. Norman Smith typically added some top boost EQ to the drum mics whilst recording, and the drums were almost always compressed on the way to tape. This was the setup the Beatles used until Revolver, when a small condenser microphone was added under the snare, and their sound continued to develop with advancements in recording technology. Take a listen to Come Together. Towards the end of the 60s, engineer and producer Glyn Johns developed a stereo miking technique which has gained wide acceptance for rock recordings. A halfway point between the simple 1 or 2 mic technique we've seen so far and full multi-miking of the drum kit, if properly executed, the Glyn Johns method creates an excellent stereo image. The first overhead mic, a condenser, goes directly over the snare drum at a height of about half a metre. If you do this technique, make sure you measure the distance. In the mix, this first mic gets panned just right of centre, about 1 or 2 o'clock on the clock face. The second overhead, the same model condenser as the first one, is placed by the floor tom. This mic should be the same distance from the target spot on the snare drum as the first overhead to keep phase issues to a minimum. This mic gets panned hard left. You can then add spot mics to the kick and snare drum. With the overheads panned as described above, pan the spot mics so that they match the kick and snare positions on the stereo image created by the overheads. This mic technique gives a massive sound with minimal setup, and was the gateway to multi-track drum recording seen in later decades. For a good example of this, listen to anything off Led Zeppelin 1. Led Zeppelin also deserve a mention for When the Levee Breaks. The drums for this track were recorded in a staircase with 2 M160 microphones, giving the massive sound you can hear on the track. The 1970s drum sound, like the sound of any era, is defined by the equipment used at the time. Single-headed toms were in high demand, and many drum kits did not come with bottom lug hardware, so resonant heads couldn't be attached. For those not in the know, a typical drum on a drum kit consists of a batter head, the drum skin you hit with a stick, and a resonant head. The resonant head resonates due to the vibrations from the hit on the batter head and adds depth to the sound. Typically, resonant heads are tuned lower than batter heads, giving that amazing doo sound on a tom, shifting from a higher pitch to a slightly lower one. The story goes that Hal Blaine, a very widely recorded drummer at the time, backed Nancy Sinatra on the Ed Sullivan Show in the 1960s, using a kit featuring single-headed toms. The performance was incredibly popular, and Blaine wrote to drum manufacturer Ludwig, suggesting that they release a series of drums in this format. The advantage of single-headed toms is that they have a very fast attack and fast decay, meaning they can poke through the rest of a drum performance, something which is important for the fills and tom work typical of the 1970s style of playing. Metal or acrylic drums were also common, particularly for the snare drum, and the expanded drum kits of the era became pretty iconic. Think Peter Criss from Kiss or Keith Moon in the video for Who Are You by The Who. The separation allowed by multi-track recording really comes to the fore in this decade as well. Listen to Dreams by Fleetwood Mac. Notice the detail in the hi-hat and, well, every instrument as well. With a good pair of headphones you can hear the variance of the stick on the hi-hat and the way that it moves around. Interestingly, this detail is balanced in the plectrum sound of the guitar panned opposite to it. The snare is crisp and cuts through the mix without detracting from any other instrument. The whole track is really just a little piece of perfection. In the 1980s, new technologies such as the advent of commercial samplers, digital effects, drum synthesizers, and MIDI changed music production permanently. As much as the 70s sound was dry and close-mic'd, the 80s sound was large, reverberant, and reflective. Recording rooms were designed to allow sounds to ring out, and digital reverb was applied liberally to snare drums. Mixing desks, such as the SSL 4000 series, allowed bus compression to be applied to groups of instruments, also massively affecting the sound of drums in the 1980s. A huge part of the sound of the 80s is gated reverb. This technique was discovered by Hugh Padgham, who was recording Phil Collins for a Peter Gabriel record at the time. Collins was using an overhead talkback microphone suspended way above his drum kit. The microphone picked up a lot of the room sound and was then heavily compressed and gated by the mixing desk. It was only intended to be a communication device. However, the result of this was a large, clipped sound to the drums. Peter Gabriel based the first track of his album, Intruder, around this technique, and Phil Collins used the technique repeatedly through various different recordings, most famously on In the Air Tonight. Drum machines and sampling technology allowed for the evolution of hip-hop, but even the rock records started to use sampled and triggered snare drums and machine-generated claps. The drums on Michael Jackson's Billie Jean were actually an overdub. The rest of the music, including the vocals, had already been put down against a drum machine. This is obviously quite unorthodox, as the drums usually form the foundation on which other musicians build their parts and feel. The tight, crisp sound was produced by recording the kick, snare, and hats on the principal overdub, with minimal ambient microphones used, and then tracking additional tom fills and a solitary crash cymbal at the start of each chorus. Take a listen to Billie Jean if you want to hear. The drum sound of the 90s was influenced further by the growing hip-hop scene, sampling culture, and also the loudness war, the process of mastering records so that they sound as loud as possible and stick out when played on the radio, thus selling more records. The Piccolo Snare became more commonplace, particularly in rock music, a sharp crack of an instrument which cuts through mixes. These snares also saw some considerable action on drum and bass recordings. Listen to the start of Two Princes by Spin Doctors for a typical piccolo snare sound. Grunge music was one of the big influences of the decade, along with a move away from the larger drum sounds of the 80s with drier recordings more in vogue again. Clickier and fuller kick drums become more prominent in all genres, and a smaller drum kit was also more typical. See Bulls on Parade by Rage Against the Machine and This Kiss by Faith Hill for really good examples. And yes, I did just draw a comparison between Rage and Faith Hill. The greater availability of digital technology and even digital audio workstations started to allow greater editing of sounds. This meant tighter and cleaner performances, though some would argue that this has sanitized music. The millennium marked a transitional time for music recording, with the loudness war coming to a head at the same time as music piracy, decreasing music revenue, and the democratization of recording through home studios and digital audio workstations, leading to the closing of many studios. Heavy compression on drums often meant that the harmonic content of the drums was further exposed and parts of the kit all sounded like they were played at the same volume. Listen to the snare drum on Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, or the lack of drum dynamics on The View from the Afternoon by the Arctic Monkeys. Heavy compression was supplemented by a new unit called a transient shaper or transient designer, which was widely used to increase the attack, and therefore the punch, of drum kits. See Phone Home by the Dillinger Escape Plan for an example. For an example of the effect of the loudness war, listen to Can't Stop by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Notice how brutally loud it is and how overcompressed every element is. Listen to it a few times through and you'll notice that your ears get really quickly fatigued due to this. There's also a general tendency to mix to the overhead mics from the early 2000s onwards, allowing a nicely set up pair of overheads to set the stereo image with heavily compressed closed mics reinforcing them. The whole drum kit is often put through another compressor to squeeze out even more loudness. The focus of the last 10 years seems to be on bigger and more powerful close-mic'd sounds in rock music. Typical rock kicks are more reminiscent of a four-to-the-floor dance music beat than a drum kit from 40 years ago. The prevalence of locking these beats to a tempo grid only serves to highlight this. See Major System Error by Marmozets for what I think is a good example of this. Popular music in general has also been exploring textural elements within all instrumentation, which percussion has been a big part of. There has been a recent resurgence in large 80s-style drum kits, along with gated reverb. But in general, drums have been dry, powerful, and prominent. There's also now a definite blurring between the technical experimentation seen in the studio in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and the experimentations that drummers have always done. For example, in Swag Times by Bill Lawrence, we can hear the mix of drum samples and triggers blending with the playing of the full kit. A cymbal on top of a snare drum is also used in this track to give a particularly sharp snare sound. This effect can also be heard on Lingus by Snarky Puppy, along with my personal favourite kick sound that we've seen in this video. Make sure you also catch the incredible keyboard solo. YouTube has an amazing video of the live recording session and it's well worth a watch. Okay, that's enough history for now. I want you to take a moment to think about the most important thing in any recording. Pause the video if you like and take a moment. Okay, so what is the most important thing in any recording? You might have said the room, the microphone, or the equipment. If you said any of these, I'm afraid you're absolutely wrong. The most important thing in any recording is the sound you're recording. If it sounds terrible at source, you're never going to get a great recording of it. With that in mind, I would urge you to always ensure your drums, and any instrument, is properly tuned before recording. I've linked to a great tutorial on this by DW Drums below this video.